Welcome to Artificiality, where minds meet machines. We founded Artificiality to help people make sense of artificial intelligence. Every week, we publish essays, podcasts, and research to help you be smarter about AI. Please check out all of Artificiality at www.artificiality.world. We're excited to welcome to the podcast John Havens, a multifaceted thinker at the intersection of technology, ethics, and sustainability. John's journey has taken him from professional acting to becoming a thought leader in AI ethics and human well-being. In his 2016 book, Heartificial Intelligence, Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines, John presents a thought-provoking examination of humanity's relationship with AI. He introduces the concept of codifying our values, our crucial need as a species to define and understand our own ethics before we entrust machines to make decisions for us. Through an interplay of fictional vignettes and real-world examples, the book illuminates the fundamental interplay between human values and machine intelligence, arguing that while AI can measure and improve well-being, it cannot automate it. John advocates for greater investment in understanding our own values and ethics to better navigate our relationship with increasingly sophisticated AI systems. In this conversation, we dive into the key ideas from artificial intelligence and their profound implications for the future of both human and artificial intelligence. We explore questions like, what are the core components of human values that AI systems need to understand? How can we design AI systems to augment rather than replace human decision-making? Why has the field of AI ethics lagged behind technological development? And what role can positive psychology play in bridging this gap? Should we be concerned about AI systems usurping our ability to define our own values, or are there inherent limits to what machines can understand about human ethics? Let's dive into our conversation with John Havens. John, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to talk to you today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Helen and Dave, for having me on the show.
So let's rewind the clock. Back to, I guess it was 2016 when it was published. I would love to hear your story of what inspired you to write Artificial Intelligence then.
Well, thank you for asking. My book, Artificial Intelligence, the subtitle is Embracing Our Humanity to Maximize Machines. And the subtitle gives a lot of context for what inspired me. I'd written quite a few articles for The Guardian at the time. I had regularly written for Mashable for a couple of years, writing some AI articles. And I saw a challenging for me precedent that people, myself included, whether it was machines or algorithms or the idea of machines or algorithms, and some combination of what people call artificial intelligence, which is really a narrative or an imaginary versus technology. And I could mention more about that in a minute. But there was this ease of sacrificing relationship, or I guess usurping the opportunity for growth with humans, and that includes ourselves and others. And now I know nature from my current work in sustainability, in lieu of sort of saying, well, this other thing will do it instead of me. So that part of the book came from fear. And like most of the work I do in technology and well-being, somewhere in the journey, it transforms into the opportunity for discovery and joy.
How do you think about putting that book in frame of reference today? You know, I look back at it and my reflection is you were talking about a lot of things then that have become much more relevant and in a lot of people's consciousness now. But I also kind of wonder what you think, you know, what's changed since then? How do you look back on that book? How do you think about what you got right, what you didn't get right? What's your sort of historical lens looking back, you know, the last 8 years, I guess it would be?
Well, thanks for asking. I know when we were prepping for the show, we bonded over the fact that you, Helen, and Dave are kind of in the same boat. You know, you were starting to think about these things at a similar time frame. So I've never really called myself a futurist. Some people attribute that title. I find it, I don't know why it bothers me. I guess it's because it's seems pretentious maybe at times for myself. I don't mean if someone else calls themselves that. But for me, what I hope...
I agree.
Yeah, we have the same problem.
Okay, good.
We totally do. We never use that
bonding.
term for ourselves either. And I think it is I think you nailed it. I think I hadn't been able to put the word on it, is that it feels pretentious if I put it on ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like, then I'll say this for myself. I'd be intrigued to hear what you think, because as I mentioned, I also really appreciate what you're doing. And I found your writing on artificiality really resonating with me. I'm like a presentist who just likes to study things a lot. And then where there's patterns, and I forget the term, it's in one of the books I'm reading, and you asked about what books I'm reading. I'll mention it in a second. But one of the characters in one of the books I'm reading, I can remember the term, but it's a state, or maybe it's a mental illness where you think everything is deeply relevant because you've discovered it. So maybe it's a form of myopia or arrogance. Anyway, I think there's a couple things about the book which is interesting, and this will be relevant. So if it sounds TMI, I'll give you the specifics. But I was married for 23 years, and my wife left, and that was 4.5 years ago or so. And then I had the massive blessing of meeting my wife, because that person was just my ex-wife, and Gabrielle, who I mentioned with all these beautiful books. She is my life partner, and I'm so blessed. And it's interesting though, in the book, the character of me, I wrote, if people haven't seen the book or read the book, the chapters open with fictional vignettes of a fictionalized version of myself. And I did that because I felt it was much easier, and I've written other fiction before, to facilitate me as a character having dialogue with other people in my life, whether it was my kids, because I have a son and a daughter in the book, and I have a son and a daughter in real life, or other characters, like I pretended I was at South by Southwest and met someone from Google and had the confrontation, which I'm sure comes off as highly pretentious and arrogant, like that Google would actually come to me and say, stop writing your book about data, whatever. But so I think what's interesting, I bring up my divorce because some things kind of came true, which I guess maybe I didn't know were there under the surface. And then the subtitle for the book about embracing our values and whatever else, I've been really challenged with, like, where are things about myself I didn't see before, and where are things about relationships that I want to improve, and then what are things that I missed even with the help of technology. And then mostly, certainly with my kids, I will do everything in my power to make sure I can be the best dad I can be. And you don't get to stop doing that. At least I don't think a parent should sort of be like, I'm good, even if my kids are 21 and 19. So I don't mean I'm up in their grill, which they remind me not to do too often. But that's a bit of a long answer, but I think that's the personal side. I can do a secondary answer to elaborate if you want me to talk about sort of technical side and the societal side, but that's the personal side.
One of the things that caught me about the book that I haven't actually seen since, and I wonder why, that you raise some sort of really almost obvious questions that no one says. Like, why is it okay to have a robot look after elderly folk but not toddlers? Now, what's the difference there? Now, and just sort of, they are obvious questions, but you don't really hear a lot about the answers from a lot of people. So I'm curious how you sort of took those narratives through to a final sort of conclusion, and what you've learned since.
Oh, thank you, Helen. A great question. I think I wrote an article for, maybe it was Quartz, I think, about parenting. And that's something I have various things I'm working on now on this idea, which I think relates to the idea of toddlers and seniors and all that. But if something can be replaced, a skill or a job, which is what a lot of the AI conversation I've talked about for well over a decade. At what point would a person, and this would vary wildly depending on the region of the planet and all that, China versus the States. But at what point would a person say, listen, I know that I'm not as good at X, in the same way, like no one really says, like, I can't run as fast as a BMW when it's going 100 miles an hour. Like, you don't feel shame about that anymore these days, I guess. But parenting, and especially in a relationship, and I mentioned my situation before, it's like, at what point, would a Minority Report like film or Philip K. Dick kind of situation dictate where a person you'd be mandated not to have a relationship, and you'd be mandated not to have a child. And the surveillance economy, which has been here for 15 years minimal, you have an Alexa in your house or whatever else, and you yell a lot. Okay, so when you yell, is it stub my toe, or is it you yell because you're angry? And then someone's like, but wait, there's another person in the house, so it's not this person yelling alone. And then the language takes on a certain tone, and all the sensors have been able to measure voice timbre for years. And then this happens and that happens, and the accusations, and then your child is taken away or whatever. And there's a lot of precedence about this technology in a narrative that's often used to support kind of techno-utopianism. This person was taken out of a dangerous situation, which as a parent or as a human, a lot of me is like, well, that sounds like a good idea. But there's a show called Humans, which I think, it came out maybe after my book, the British show. One of the scariest moments in any AI show I've ever seen, and Black Mirror has a lot of good ones, was this, of course, gorgeous robot, because the morphology of most robots is hot young women. Shocking, because the boy nerds
I wonder why.
make everything.
Who would guess? Yeah.
Who would guess? Although on this show, to their credit, they had an overweight robot, which I love. I praise them for doing that. Anyway, one of the main characters was a robot who was a nanny and took care of a 6-year-old girl of a mother, the human mother of the girl, struggled with alcoholism. And one of the most harrowing scenes I've seen in any film or TV show, the alcoholic mother comes home and the whole family is waiting for her, and the robot nanny has her arm around the 6-year-old. And the woman comes home and she's drunk, but she's not yelling too much or hitting anybody. But the moment where she says, okay, Susie, or whatever the girl's name is, let's go read a book. And the girl says, I don't want to read a book with you. I want to read a book with Jenny, or whatever the robot is. And she says, no, come read with mommy. And she says, I prefer Jenny. And so back to your question, Helen, is in the book, what I wanted to do is examine that moment of like, when you can't force the relationship, when you can't mandate what the other person would do. And I know I mentioned surveillance and governments coming in and all that, but really I think it's at a central point. It's like, that's, I think, most scary for most people. At least I'll speak for myself. And I mentioned the loss of the divorce and situations where my kids have said, kind of give me some space. Those moments, I think, are more scary than, like getting shot or like crushed by the Terminator. Like those things would suck, but they'd be kind of fast and instant, and mainly they're just silly. The harder challenge is dealing with the loss of those relationships and then saying, am I equipped to deal with loss? And if not, no system that I've experienced so far will replace the possibility not just of another human, but the possibility of the moment where you are given the opportunity to give kindness to someone else. I think about this all the time since the divorce. Not all the time, because now Gabby's here. And I'm like, okay, I was sad for a while. Now I don't need to be. But even there, it's this gift of knowing that when you have the opportunity to give someone else a kindness, that is a healing that you'll be able to receive. That, as bad as you may feel about yourself, and I don't really feel bad about myself all the time, but the point is that was a big shock in my life, and that it has equipped me to say, this is now a vision. This is a new goal in my life and my work, is to not let people be condemned in their own mind to avoid relationship. And a lot of AGI, large language models, especially with anthropomorphism, are denying at the front end of a lot of these experiences, UI, UX, humans, the agency, especially young people, to understand how to have relationships where they don't enter into most of their relationships thinking, well, I've already been talking with ChatGPT or Anthropic, whoever, and they have my back if the humans don't.
It's interesting because you're talking about anticipating a loss, due to machines in some way, right? And I'm reminded of something that one of my old friends, who was a very senior engineer, used to say to me. He said, nobody cares about surveillance until it happens to them. Nobody cares about the fact that everybody's tracking all of your data until the police come and knock on your door and they accuse you of doing something, and so it's all personal. But what you did in your book and you're doing now is to anticipate that this happens to you, and what might that feel like as an individual. And I find that to be really quite compelling, because so much of what's happening now in this state, this timeline, are these grand pronouncements about how incredible this stuff will be and how it's going to save the world and it's going to solve the loneliness epidemic and all of these kinds of things. But it's all generalized at a very large scale, and not getting to that point where you have a moment to listen to yourself and think about it being your thing. And that can be both positive and negative. There are things where I think these tools can be quite compelling on an individual basis too, but you could sort of getting people down that path to consider the loss for themselves, to consider the interruption of their relationship with a child themselves, and what might that be like to think about it as an individual, not just as this grand society thing.
I want to go back to something that you said that I actually think is really subtle and I hadn't thought about before, about a moment. And I remember reading a book a long time ago, which I think was by the Heath brothers, about moments. And life is lived in moments. And there's a remarkable asymmetry in moments. You can have a moment that you literally remember for your entire life, or a moment that pushes you in a different trajectory. And I think something that you said that I hadn't thought about before that's really subtle and interesting is, if you have a broad expectation that, and very broad, you might even it might just be a feeling, not even something you can articulate, but just a feeling that machines are able to take over intimate aspects of your life, friendships, learning, creativity, things that we really value. And you have this expectation, you act according to that expectation. So you put more reliance, perhaps you overtrust the AI you're working with, or you expect it to be able to do more than it does. And our biases being what they are, we sort of wash that out because we just keep moving on with our days. But what you end up actually doing is depriving yourself of moments that never happen. And they could be just the tiniest fractions in time. And I'm thinking about this through the frame of raising teenagers, where teenagers are the ultimate example of you have to have them there for those moments to occur. You have to be available as a parent when you have a teenager, because you never know when you're going to get. You can have all sorts of sort of nothingness for days, and then you have a 30-second moment that allows you to be that parent that they need right then. And I hadn't thought about what you articulated, which to me sounded like even just this expectation, this narrative that machines can take over these intimate times and these intimate processes deprives us of these opportunities. And it's almost like reconceptualizing how you interact with both people and with machines to see more about moments as opposed to more about just a stream of productive helpfulness. Maybe that's what's been bothering me about these productivity narratives, that they make every moment in time the same. They sort of flatten moments to nothingness.
I couldn't agree with you more. I've written for years about aspects of economics, and now I work in sustainability, and I often wonder if I conflate things. And then I'm like, when people say that you're conflating, I usually get irritated because I'm like, I think people are just biased and don't work enough in transdisciplinary situations, or maybe they haven't had the blessing. I went to college to be a minister. I ended up being an actor. I worked in PR and big business. My dad died, who was a psychiatrist. I fell into positive psychology, and my mom is a minister, and I've been a blues musician for 40 years. So there's all these languages that I speak that are much more comfortable for me than like certain engineering discussions or being like on a standards development working group call, which I enjoy, but they tend to be quite formal in the sense of like you take minutes and all that stuff. But a couple of things I wanted to point out. First of all is just some, I'll use the word fact. Having written a book in 2014 called Hacking Happiness, Why Your Personal Data Counts, How Tracking It Can Change the World. Humans don't have in general, unless you live like in Estonia, who's got an amazing data sovereignty situation between people and the government. We don't, as individuals, understand what it means to have parity with regards to our personal data and the algorithmic world. So I just wanted to make that point in terms of digital stuff and machines. There is not a parity in terms of agency or legality or intellectual property that we all assume, right? Like right now I'm speaking to the two of you, and I've read your work. I appreciate your invitation. There's a lot of cultural norms that we just take for granted. Ironically, we are talking through a set of digital services where, for instance, I've been on a lot of WebEx calls recently, and either otter.ai or a different AI service just attends in lieu of someone else. That happened this morning on a call. And the people are lovely, and they're like, oh, this is cool. I couldn't join the whole meeting. And my work for well over 12 or 13 years about personal data stuff, I just have to smile. I'm like, yeah, it's great. It takes note. You didn't ask. You didn't ask me. It just appeared in my life. So I bring that up, and I get intense fast, so I'll calm down, except to say what should also be there is something we're working on in one of our standards in where I work, which is IEEE, the world's largest professional technological association. I'm speaking here today as John, the author. But there's a standard working group. It's called 7012 because we number everything with a chair who's one of my heroes, a guy named Dr. Searle. He and his wife, Joyce, have really been leaders in the personal data community for 20 years. He wrote a wonderful book called The Intention Economy, which in terms of aspects of marketing kind of turns everything on its head. The logic is we should be able to signal governments, businesses, and say, here's what I want to buy. It reverses so much energy with the surveillance economy and the attention economy, because the logic is I have to capture your attention at all times. We have to be productive at all times. Now, just to make this faster so I don't take 2 hours on this, because it was a different book, personal data assistants in one sense are kind of boring. And 7012, it's revolutionary, but if it happens, it essentially means that the three of us would have kind of pull down menus where we talk about our preferences for how we want our data to be shared. Reid Hoffman from LinkedIn talked about this a couple weeks ago, which is fantastic. I have a lot of respect for him. And he called it having a personalized AI agent. And really all this means is an algorithmic representation of you, right? But it's not you like a sentient version of John. It's kind of boring. It's like your passport. Here's the algorithmic version of my passport. Sexy. It doesn't have to be sexy. It's a foundational tool to say I have parity, and parity. The parity right now is that people use tools. And I'll give an example, like a chat GPT. People use these tools, and they think, is it real? Is it sentient? And I did this 2 days ago for a different talk because I test it every once in a while. Have fun. And by that I'm being ironic. Most large language models type these 3 words in English, because by the way, most of these tools, I can't speak for other languages, but in English, are you real? Those 3 words. The answer you'll get typically is something like, this is a direct quote, in a sense, I'm real. And I pause there because if you work with philosophers, the answer, in a sense, I'm real, that's the day. Like, I hope you have a conference. I hope you have a weekend and a lot of good wine, because someone answering, are you real? And like Plato comes out of the cave, or Confucius is like, well, I want to talk about harmony, or, Ubuntu ethics is like, what about the virtues? Whatever it is. And someone's like, in a sense, I'm real. You're done. Like, there it is. So a system, however, saying, in a sense, I'm real to a child is by design absolutely manipulative, period. End of story. And having written for The Guardian and all these different places, that is not disclosure. Now, some of the system, Anthropic and others, will say, this is a convention that's used to help a narrative in English, right? But then do this. Have fun with this. Then say, stop saying I, right? The I, the pronoun. You could put commas around it, right? Which, if anyone's done any form of basic code, like, let's make it easy for the system. Please don't use that pronoun I. And I did this 2 days ago on ChatGPT, right? Stop using I. The system responds, I'm sorry I've made you uncomfortable by saying I. Then you say, stop saying I. I will stop saying I in my answers. Stop saying I. I understand that I should stop saying I. So if you do that, you realize a couple of things. This is not a great system. The architecture for large language models, and my heroes right now, the people like Gary Marcus, this is not to put down all of artificial intelligence. That's like saying the internet. That's why I say artificial intelligence, the phrase is a narrative. But when you do that and you look at a tool that's created by obviously so many very smart people, and if you know about large language models, how they pull data, it's the same response being pulled over and over. But I gave it a very simple direct command. I don't think there's a whole lot of wondering, well, what does the user mean by stop saying the pronoun I? Stop using the pronoun I. Please refrain from, like, any of the forms come back to the system saying, I will stop doing this. And so what you also know is it's not real. It's pre-programmed. It hasn't been tested very well. It is by design manipulative because there's a not formal way to give people a real fighting chance of disclosure. Because, by the way, some systems, I think Anthropic, to their credit, actually change the pronoun. It is understood that the person using the system is uncomfortable using pronoun. This is a device used to whatever. Okay, right? But by and large, I want to be clear, most large language models are training all of humanity to assume that the systems are sentient and real and a person. So personal data, that training are critical for me to answer the rest of the question, because there's no parity. There's no opportunity in those situations to have a freedom to then discover, do I want to believe the systems are real? That's a faith issue, right? I'm not here to deny someone's faith. And another hero, I have a lot of them, Sherry Turkle from MIT in her book, blanking which one it was, but she said when it comes to
Together
robots,
Alone, was it?
Oh yes, Alone Together. She says we're ready when it comes to robots. We're ready for the romance. But my final point here, to calm down now, because I just get enraged because it's all obfuscation. It's all the neoliberalism. It's all the isms. But the main reason it makes me sad, and I'm so glad you talked about moments, and then let me focus on a positive thing, which is in those moments, pheromonally, and the social science around things like positive psychology points out that being present for a moment is where you have the biggest opportunity to most viscerally and genuinely connect with another human. And if one thinks they're connected to a system, again, that's a whole other conversation along the lines of, in a sense, I'm real. But where you are opposite, certainly your teenager, your child, or where you're opposite someone, a stranger, for instance, and whatever, they drop their phone and you bend down and pick it up and you look in their eyes. That moment, if it wasn't manufactured, and even if it is, that's so exciting about the science of compassion. Those moments, the actual chemicals that change your brain structure, connect you to others, and they galvanize those moments. And like you said, that's the science, is you remember those things for ages because it's an actual moment of connection with another human that, and this is not to be negative to machines or algorithms or systems, that so far to date cannot be replicated. And more importantly, it's like, why would you try to replicate them? And then also the entire framing of, well, a machine or human can do this better than that. It's immaterial.
There's so much there that I want to unpack. So, and I'm not sure why I use that phrase because I usually don't like it very much. But I will say so many things there that I do want to comment on. One was the question of, are you real? Is fascinating, and I'm going to go try that. It's one of the reasons that we chose the term artificiality for us, is the question of reality and what is reality, and what does it mean as ourselves, so clearly extend beyond our physical boundaries and our physical bodies in this modern age, and we use that as a question, not as an advocacy or anything else, but as sort of a pursuit to understand what that is today and what it might become. You also make a very very good point, and you make it eloquently, that this risk factor when the machines, as you say, won't stop saying I, but they're beyond that. They've been designed to recreate or mimic or aspire to human-like language. There's a good logic to that. You can understand why that is a good objective for a large language model, that it has human-like language, because that's going to be most effective in communicating with a variety of humans. There's a problem, though, that I sort of come at this from the question of I come at this whole world from the world of humanities and design, and so I think about it from that perspective. And the biggest problem with the language and trying to replicate human language is we humans constantly looking for human traits everywhere we look. We've evolved to find commonality with others in our species, with others in our tribe, the way we speak, the language, the accents, the affectations, the memes we share in the modern day. These are all about finding things that make us feel like the thing that we're talking with is similar to us, so that, if you have a dog, everybody aspires, human like emotions to the dog. And the dog doesn't have that. It doesn't feel love in the way we feel love. It has some form of bonding because it sees us as part of our pack. But we see human love in that being. And so when a machine talks to us in a way that sounds human, we're going to find commonality with it as a human, which is a very dangerous thing to play with, and I worry very much about that sort of distinction and this question of, we've gone through these phases of, well, should a machine have to disclose that it's a machine? Okay, maybe that might be one out, but it could still sound so much like a human that our intuition is going to take us in one direction, right? Our instinct is literally going to say, oh, that's kind of like me. Even if it says it's not like me, I'm going to feel it's like me, right? Like we're dealing with these sort of these emotional connections that we create with things that I'm not sure how many people that are creating the machines are actually thinking about. Or if they are, they're thinking about it from a commercial standpoint, and a money-making standpoint, not from a being good for society kind of standpoint. And I'm sorry, I feel like I've launched onto my soapbox rather than asking a question.
Now, have you got a question?
Yes, I know you're going to bug me with that one because I just did that to you. So I guess I will turn around and ask you a question of what do you find that you admire or that makes you feel hopeful? Like there's a lot of things that we can mutually point at with valid criticism, but I'm curious the things that you see that you go, oh, that's something I'm interested in. I like 7012. I'm fascinated by that. I really want to learn more about it. But what else would you highlight?
Well, first, while I'm talking to you, I'm in my house in New Jersey, and I have a window open, and the wind is blowing. And part of me is like, oh, friends are doing audio recording. I hope they don't hear it. But in the other sense, I hope you do. My dad, who passed away, as I mentioned, love the sound of the wind. So I'm often reminded of him. And not being indigenous, I still like thinking about the concept of ancestry because it ties me to my dad. I miss him. He's up. I know you're not going to show the video, but he's in the photo up here. That's, my mom's still here, but my dad. And also for myself, I've been trying to train myself. That's a wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass. If you haven't read it, as a Westerner, and that's a very general term, but as a guy who grew up outside of Boston, and nature was always sort of an exterior and lovely, going to camp and all that. But I've been trying to listen to nature in ways, again, that don't make me feel like I'm pretentious or trying to do some kind of feeling from someone, but I just go out in nature, and not every time, but like just now, hearing the trees, I instantly feel better. And I think being trained to listen to nature is, for me, a connection to my faith. I went to college to be a minister in the Christian tradition. And I'm bringing this up because you said, what's something that inspires me? I'll name you a person, which is Pope Francis. And I'm not Catholic. But his 2015, what's called an encyclical, which I believe is a sort of statement. I don't know what other church level authority it has. But he wrote this beautiful piece called Laudato Si, which is about a call for what he calls our common home. I love that idea. And having studied in college to be a minister in a Christian, Judeo-Christian tradition, my mom's Methodist, I went to a Baptist church. I really just mainly say, like, I'm a big fan of Jesus' work. And if you're being kind to other people and loving them, let's start from that point versus like, let's go fight about infant baptism, which just doesn't seem like something to spend a lot of time on. But without being ironic or whatever else, Laudato Si is really a call, a clarion call to say, if Jesus, one believes in the Beatitude, that there was a historical person named Jesus who said, blessed are the poor, both actually poor and then poor in spirit. Francis says the earth, we have to consider the earth as our common home and a living entity. And a lot of people think metaphorically of Eden, which is in a lot of different philosophical or religious traditions. And that's actually not as much about the scorn of Eve making a mistake. And of course, everyone knows Adam stood there like a dork watching her eat the apple anyway, right? So it shouldn't be ever a thing about gender. But the point being, it's a separation of the love of a loving parent. Eden is being cast out of the loving embrace of Abba, Yahweh. Anyway, so 2015 is this beautiful piece. It's long, but it's worth the read. And he also starts to talk about technology and modernity. And I think what you mentioned earlier, Helen, about things about productivity. These moments that we miss, we all miss moments, so it's not condemnation. But the moments that we are influenced to miss because we've been given the myth and the lie and the ideological, very, very driven, mendacious lie that you only have worth if you're productive, is not, beyond just not being true, it's harmful, because it means that all these different moments that if we have the luxury of having enough money, if we have the luxury of having credit, we don't have money, but you're forced to think all the time, I got to get back to work. And that's, anyway, I want to focus too. Pope Francis, just last year, 2023, came out with something called Laudato Deum, D-E-U-M, which I call Laudato Deum, because if you read it, he is not subtle about technological utopianism. He is very, very not just concerned. He's basically saying we are putting things in place of loving each other, taking care of the planet. Stop it. And he also, and I'll pause after I mention this because it's a really good topic, a subject. The two of you probably do this as well as future presentists types. You come up with a phrase and you think, no one's thought of this. Then you research it, someone else did. But a friend of mine who's indigenous, she's from Indonesia, she called me like 7 months ago. Like, did you hear that Pope Francis repudiated the idea of the doctrine of discovery? And I was like, you're going to have to catch me up on pretty much that entire sentence. And she goes, okay. The doctrine of discovery in the Catholic Church goes back, I think, a millennia, where one of the popes was like, hey, Spain, Portugal, divide the world. Go for it. proselytized, and this is me, John, not saying anything negative about the Catholic Church per se, right? But someone said, go and if they don't believe in Jesus, kill them, or that was interpreted. And anyways, the colonization was born, and also the idea of manifest destiny, or the idea of you put a flag somewhere and you say, this is my land, even though there's indigenous or First Nations people there. So Pope Francis went to Canada about a year ago and apologized, which I got to say, I think the humility of the man I find very attractive. I think humility in general is deeply attractive to me, mainly because as a human, I'm like, then I want to hang out with you because I think you're reminding other people that the opportunity to learn is an opportunity to be directly connected to a creator and awe. But anyway, he apologized in Canada and said, this is not right, what happened. And although I'm one guy and one pope, apologized. But a lot of people, indigenous folks, held up signs that said, no more doctrine of discovery. So there's an encyclical from 6 months ago, and you might say, and I'll come back to this, why it's so deeply relevant to you. And actually, I'd love to write for you guys. You mentioned that before the show started. I'd be honored to write for you guys. And one thing I'd like to write about, although there's now a couple writers whose book I need to read, and I'll find their names so we can add it to the show notes. I want to give them credit. Although this is one of those things where I thought, oh, this is a great name. And then, of course, someone else had it. Is the idea of data, a data doctrine discovery, which is exactly what's happening. A colonization, a lot of people have talked about with data, with personal data issues that I mentioned. But with a 70-12, with some kind of, by the way, I do not mean to compare in any way colonization of entire races of people decimated in North America with the data of our minds as it's taken away or supplanted by these different tools and systems. But I believe well over 12 or 13 or 14 years that when one's brain is not allowed to be one's own, which is where we're pretty much already there. That's why all these AI, when will the AGI come? It's a faith, it's an ideology, it's a agenda. That's a distraction, because what does that even mean? Again, it's like Terminator robots are here when AGI is here. Like my phone actually says, like, it's true. I really do think you're a piece of shit. Like there it is, and if I can't say that, like, really do think you're a piece of trash. But to come back to a positive thing, Pope Francis, without the religious aspect of his Catholicism necessarily, I just think this beautiful mind in modernity is saying, there's a lot of stuff that came before where we have to put the earth first. We have to love others first. And he also is making it very clear that he feels technology and AI in particular, where he really talks quite, I'm sure it's people help him out to write it and all that, but really talks eloquently and quite academically, technically about some of these issues. And the final thing I'll say in this point, which I learned because I've been to the Vatican for some meetings on AI, is the Roman Catholic Church or the Vatican is a formal sovereign nation, is the second largest owner of real estate in the planet. So now I work in sustainability, and how all this stuff is starting to come together is, what if the person who's got a lot of influence on the Catholic Church, apparently, when one is the Pope, it says, I repudiate, at least in a religious sense, the idea of the doctrine of discovery. And then the person who's saying I'm worried about AI is that same person and says, we need to give people protections, especially children. That brings me deep encouragement, because then where there are people of faith who trust in Francis or Catholicism, and they hear that message, I have something which I think probably both of you share this as well. Part of the reason of being a futurist or presentist and whatever else that's very challenging is when I wrote the book in 2016, a lot of ideas, concepts, words, people just, I didn't have the language to say them to people yet. Try to do it through the stories, through fiction. And even today, like talking to you guys is such a gift, because I'm like, I know that we're connecting. If we're learning from each other, that's a joy. But so many people, the phrases that will start off is like, well, how is AI going to be useful to my business? Make sustainability useful to my business. And there's about 40 layers where I'm like, how much time do you have? And do you want to read a book on surveillance capitalism by what's her name from Harvard? Do you want to understand the nature of aquifers draining? But really, it's more about being kind to people. And so I think ultimately the messages keep coming back to connection and parent. Whether one is formally a parent in the sense of you have children by birth, or you're a caregiver, or you have, nieces and nephews, or you just know human children. It's like the messages of like, well, they're on Instagram all the time and all this stuff. I get very angry when people are like, well, kids these days are on Instagram. I'm like, well, we built the tools that put them on those things, and they addicted them chemically. And more importantly, is it so challenging, and I'll say this for myself, to think of how I will do whatever I can to try to connect. And I love how you said it, Helen, to be present for that moment when they're ready to connect with you. And you can't always be there as a parent, but the point is if you're prepared for that, then the answer is not, well, you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram, just like I'm on my phone right now, because who cares? Anything that separates or brings isolation doesn't prioritize the opportunity for connection. And the connection that is such a joy, especially connecting to nature and oneself and others right now, and I'll go back to Francis, to your question, Dave, is like really just this clarion call to be like, look at this beautiful place that we have. And we're being distracted to not focus on it and each other and loving ourselves so we can, accepting ourselves so we can try to be kind to others. And so I guess just 2 words, Pope Francis is really giving me a lot of encouragement these days.
It's an interesting thread because if you think about sort of history of thought, as we were talking about earlier on before we started, through this movement of towards more humanism, coupled with atheism, meaning atheist, not believing in the divine. And then you bring up now the question of this belief in AGI, which is some sort of an AI theism or something. I'm gonna muck up my the word structure there, but there's something there.
An AI theist.
An AI theist, yes, and maybe that's a title for another piece coming up soon. But there is something there that there is the belief that there is a divine in the technology, and I'm not sure that. Clearly, there's this whole question around technology and sort of technocracies and all kinds of other words that have come up over the years. But I really feel like it's now that I see this connection that in AI, people do start to see some sense of divine, or they're hoping for it. And wow, that would take another few hours, if not a weekend together to talk to pick it apart.
It's an ancient story.
It is an ancient story because we humans, we aspire to, we look for, we believe in, because so much of our structure of thought for thousands of years was trying to find the divine. The Stoics found it in organization of the universe. People have been trying to find this guiding principle for their lives because it's kind of scary to think that the structure of life and value and morals and ethics come from inside us because we doubt ourselves. And so wouldn't it be nice just to have have something else that helps us out with that? That's, one thing to have developed through a variety of different thought processes over the centuries. It's very different now to have it be coded by a small group of people who aren't really thinking about these topics and what they're creating, but people are starting to believe that somehow this is all going to emerge through the LLM structure, and it's going to be able to tell us what to do.
But I mean, at the risk of not being the one nodding, I'm not sure that there's anything different.
No.
It's such an ancient story about dealing with uncertainty and social control, and having a narrative that is beyond what the group is, that the other.
Yeah, I guess the difference is that there is some principles, as you were outlining, right? There were things that attracted you to being a minister when you were younger. There was and the love and looking out for each other and blessed be the poor. And there's a lot of messages there that have some grounding, whether you believe or not. There's parts of that are attractive to all of us who care about each other. That grounding's not inside the halls of the tech companies that are creating these tools. They're not thinking about that. They're actually, that's all. This is now a worship and a divine that is resident within capitalism. And I can understand your interest of focusing a lot on sustainability too in that concept, because those forces are not helping the sustainability either.
I know we're getting up to time, and I'm curious about asking you a question that it's hypothetical, completely hypothetical, but I wrestle with it myself, which is, on one hand, I completely reject the idea of having any kind of artificial intelligence being in my mind, making me make decisions. That just sounds like a bad idea unless I truly understand how I'm sharing that data and how it's coming to those conclusions, whatever. At least I need to know something about how the system works. But then on the other hand, there's a whole lot of really other stupid people who I would like them to have. So we get to this issue of, sorry, did I make you laugh?
Don't edit that out, 'cause that's
That's fantastic. I don't want an AI in my brain, but I'd like to put an AI in a bunch of other people.
Well, it's just called classic human hypocrisy, right? So we've got this coordination problem.
Well, I'll just say, just to put it into frame of reference, we all think we're great drivers, but we always think the other people are the bad drivers.
It's the like
right?
woebegone of AI in society.
Yes.
But, you work in sustainability. We've worked in sustainability. We're everyone's terrified about what's happening with climate change. We seem completely unable to get out of our own way. Under what circumstances, or perhaps I'll put it this way, if there was a single AGI that took over this decision-making for our planet and actually took care of this and was going to do this for us and save us, what if you knew that was coming? What would you do differently in your job, your life, your speaking, about encouraging others to either react negatively or positively against that scenario? So it was like, the AI will be here in 10 years and it will make all the decisions. Humans, what do you need to do in the next 10 years to prepare for that?
Well, it's a great question, and I think I've been blessed to use more, spiritual sounding nomenclature. If one of the reasons I believe in Jesus, and I studied Scripture, I'm a fan of history, and so I never got to the depth of like Aramaic and Greek or Hebrew, but it's wonderful when I talk about this a lot. But there's a wonderful story of Jesus with a woman at the well of Samaria. And if you read that story on the surface in English and, reading scripture, the Judeo-Christian or New Testament scripture, when you even realize any number of things, like it's 33 books, there are epistles versus letters. Gospels were written by 4 different people. Luke, the physician, he wrote for the Greeks. It's a very different way that he speaks, all that stuff. But if you read that surface story, it looks like a nice dude, Jesus, talking to a woman. At one point he says, go and sin no more. You have more than one husband. And the basic concept is that probably this woman was a prostitute or something. But when you read the story, even in English, and there's New King James and all these different translations, but most of them will say something about it was the heat of the day. It was the noon of the day. And my mom, who's a minister, she's like, well, that means it was the hottest part of the day. And Samaria, Jerusalem, that time, it's the desert. Why would people get water at noon, right? That doesn't make any sense. So it means that she is the most outcast of the outcast amongst women. And women in that culture were less than anyway. And by the way, this is no comment on anyone being Jewish or early Christian. It just means that's apparently the case. Women were not, primary in the pecking order societally. And then if you know about the story of the Good Samaritan, for Jews at that time, apparently Samaria, and without giving any modern allusion to get things political, just long story short, the idea was that these people were not friends of people who believe in, who were Jewish at that time. And my point here is not to comment on Jewishness in any way, but to point out that a Samaritan person would be anathema for a person of the Jewish faith to be with. Not just, from my understanding, not just like, hey, watch out for those people, but like religiously, don't be there. Anyway, I'm going on about this because Jesus was often called a rabbi. And so what you start to realize is here's a person who is attributed with this status of rabbi, who is being recorded in multiple texts, being used and passed around to start what was one of the world's largest faiths today. And what the whole message of that for me, why it resonates so much is it is at the core about love. It is at the core about however you believe Jesus, whether he's the Son of God, whether he rose from the dead. Here's a guy who a lot of people were like, we want you to do all these things. The Zealots wanted him to be a warrior. The Pharisees and the Sadducees said, you're supposed to be a teacher. And what Jesus did, his action showed in that story, layer after layer after layer. He didn't say, hey, everything's great, go and keep doing what you're doing, but it wasn't a condemnatory go and sin no more. It was, I see you, my daughter. I love you, my daughter. And I want you to have a relationship again with our dad, with Abba. We miss you. I love you. That's the message that's resonated with me since I was 8 or 9 in terms of my faith. I bring us all this up in regards to your question because that still allows me free will. It still allows me the sense of believing over and over and over again where I've rejected Christ in my faith dozens of times in my life, dozens of times. But I feel a call, a very personal call, still and silent voice saying, John, it's not about you being broken. It's not about you being less than, or it's not about you being not sinful. I love you and I have a purpose for you, which is to do your best to love other people, as clumsy as you may be. But I love you. You have the choice to not believe in me. But I bring all this up because your question about AGI being here in 10 years, I just tweeted this today. I will not call it X. I tweeted this today where I said, waiting for AGI is the same as waiting for Jesus. I didn't mean it in a bad way or a negative way. I meant it's the same. Whereas if I start talking to you like I just did, I can give you layer upon layer of scriptural quote proof that Jesus existed. And then my, logic or the historical aspect of the resurrection. At some point, I either will shift to a non-intentional proselytization, a sharing of faith where, the historical stuff is fascinating to me. It's not always to other people, or ultimately it's going to be about relationship. So it's not that your question isn't a great one in one sense, Helen. It's that AGI in people's minds is already here. No one agrees on it, whether it's Hinton or this person or Kurzweil. And where people say it's going to be here in 2 years, it distracts us from the recognition that we have work to do now. We have love to give now. I don't read Jesus's stories about Jesus and his disciples being perfect. Peter and Paul fought. Paul wrote a lot of letters, the epistle, to the Ephesians, hey, what are you doing? Come out. That's not what Jesus meant. And these people saw Jesus in the flesh. So the point is, if we don't have the opportunity to love other people and we think that we can rely on a machine to fix us, machines can help. And there's a lot of good, apps, I don't call them companions, but assistants that can equip. But it's in those moments where we're going to not mess up or quote be sinful, but be human, that we will have to be allowed to learn and discern. For myself, my heart breaks thinking, well, what if I had done this or that or that? And the answer is, I don't know. But I know in my heart of hearts that even 10 years from now, if there was some AGI that made decision, that the moments then that I would be looking for to have a true moment with someone would be missed because I'd be relying on something else versus the training and the equipping to be present and be prepared to try and love.
So let's ask you a question with all of the books that are behind you that unfortunately the listeners cannot see. What books are you reading right now? What would you tell us to pick up and try and read?
And I'll make these answers shorter because I know when I start talking about things like the Bible, it can go for a long time. One was, it's called Now, The Physics of Time, and I'm blanking on the author, but I'm trying to understand physics better, which I realize is like saying, I'm kind of real or whatever I said before. But I love physics. I love the aspects of time. And Helen, you kind of talked about this too, is that in these actual moments where we are present with each other, I think time does actually freeze. And our brain kind of freezes things. And the author of this book, I'm blanking on his name, he also talks about faith at the end of the book. I think he's Christian, but when I say faith, I'm not focusing on Christian versus Judaism versus Buddhism versus. I'm saying someone who says, I'm not sure of all that's out there and I'm in awe. And that's what he says. He says everyone knows that they're a real scientist, that the scientific theory is a theory, A. B, it's something that we all know until the next thing kind of replaces this current thing. This is the best that we'll all do. That's great, but it's not, galvanized for the rest of it. And this wonderful, beautiful sense of awe. So that's a great book. This one I'm still working on. It's called Double X. It's by Rian Hughes. It's fantastic. He has all these different, it's sort of a half graphic novel. You can't, I know your viewers won't be able to see this, but there's tons of code in it. This is the one I mentioned. There's a character who thinks he's the kind of main geek in London who's got an AI company. He thinks that everything he does have prescient. And the whole book starts off where an alien force of some kind is beamed to Earth. But what makes it different than most other alien beaming to Earth stuff, because that's a rule I don't really get into those stories, is the whole beam is made up of code. And so the book is really this metaphor about how we speak, how we communicate, code, and just really cool graphic novel with like stories within a story within a story. Anyway, those are the books. Oh, and the last one I'll mention, and I have to pick it up, is Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey. And it's a beautiful book. She calls herself like the nap goddess, the nap queen. She's Black. I bring that up because she talks about how real resistance to capitalism is this sense of rest, allowing, present. And in her case, she talks about the history of slaves, and one of the only ways that they could actually resist was to be slower at times. And it's this fantastic book, which is bringing me a lot of peace in the sense of how to address a lot of the issues we're talking about today, which lead me to have a sense of peace versus anxiety.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking the time. It's been really great to talk to you.
Same here. Thank you.
Spirit, solid state.